Section 5 is about the process of homeostasis. Let's begin by defining homeostasis. Homeostasis is the ability to maintain relatively stable internal conditions despite changes that are occurring in the outside environment. Our bodies detect change, and in turn our bodies will activate mechanisms in order to oppose that change. Another term I'd like you to know is dynamic equilibrium. The conditions inside our bodies are not static. They are not always perfectly constant. Those conditions, they'll fluctuate within what we call a normal range, where our bodies will function optimally. So for example, the temperature of our body is not perfectly constant. There are highs and there are lows, but there's a range, a narrow range, where our body will operate normally. Another term I'd like you to know is set point. Set point is the value around which the normal range fluctuates. So for example, let's take human body temperature. The normal set point for human body temperature is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. But the normal range for human body temperature can be anywhere from 97.7 degrees Fahrenheit to 99.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And within that range, your body would still operate normally. This graph here illustrates the homeostasis of blood glucose. Glucose in our blood is not static. It goes up and down within a normal range. That range is anywhere from 80 to 100 milligrams per milliliter, as you can see on this graph. Now, the set point, sort of the average normal blood glucose level, would be indicated by the dotted line down the center, which is about 90 milligrams per milliliter. Now, as blood glucose goes up, homeostatic processes will counteract and cause the blood glucose to drop again. And as the blood glucose gets too low, homeostasis once again will counteract that and cause our blood glucose levels to increase. Another concept I'd like you to know in homeostasis is the idea of feedback. Feedback can be divided into two different types: negative feedback and positive feedback. Negative feedback mechanisms are those that reverse a deviation from our set point. So for example, our body temperature is normally 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Maybe you're running, maybe you're in a room that's really hot, and your body temperature begins to increase above your normal set point. There are processes like sweating and blood vessel dilation that allow your body to begin to cool back down. That's a negative feedback. It's pushing back against a change. In contrast, positive feedback processes amplify a deviation from a set point. So if there's some sort of change, the change is going to become even stronger. These types of feedback are not normal, or very rare, I should say. And they only occur if there's going to be some sort of end point to the positive feedback process. The most well understood example would be during labor. Processes that lead to contractions amplify those contractions until the baby is born, and that would be the end point. In order for homeostasis to work, feedback loops require three components: receptors, integrating centers, and effectors. The receptor is a structure in the body that senses a change. The integrating center is a structure in the body that processes those sensations and will make a decision about what to do. It directs the body's response. And then finally, an effector is a structure in the body that carries out the corrective action. It will restore the body back to homeostasis. To illustrate a negative feedback process, let's use an increase in blood pressure as an example. So some process is going to cause an increase in our blood pressure. We have receptors in some of our blood vessels called baroreceptors. They sense blood pressure and they will send a nerve signal to our brain. Our brain is the control center that interprets that change and will send out a signal to the effectors telling them to counteract that change. In this example, the effectors are heart and our blood vessels. Our brain is going to tell our heart to beat more slowly and our blood vessels to dilate. Both of those things will counteract that increasing blood pressure and cause the blood pressure to drop. That's an example of negative feedback. In the final section of this chapter, we're going to discuss the human atlas. In anatomy, we have to have a standard set of terminology in order to communicate effectively. Just like geography uses terminology like north, south, east, and west, anatomy uses its own unique set of terms to help us identify and locate various body parts. To begin, let's define anatomical position. This is a standard point of reference for anatomical study. So the human body must be in a certain position for us to describe locations of parts properly. This position is when a person is standing upright, their arms are at their sides, their palms are turned forward or anterior, and the eyes are pointing forward. In geography, on maps, imaginary lines of latitude and longitude are used to help us locate and identify different points of interest. In a similar way, anatomy uses imaginary planes and sections to help us identify and locate parts. So planes and sections are imaginary surfaces that run through the body. The imaginary plane that divides the body into front and back halves is known as the frontal or coronal section. The plane that divides the body into upper and lower halves is known as the transverse plane. The plane that divides the body into right and left halves is the sagittal plane. And then finally, a plane that would run at any sort of odd angle through the body, as can be seen, the plane that runs through the leg here, is known as an oblique plane. Now on the slide you can see all of the planes labeled. Note that the sagittal plane comes in two forms. If the sagittal plane is perfectly down the center, dividing the body into perfect right and left halves, that's known as the mid-sagittal plane or midline. And if the sagittal plane is off to the left a little bit or off to the right, that's known as a parasagittal plane. This diagram shows the brain cut along various planes into different sections. In the upper left, you can see the brain has been cut along the frontal plane, dividing it into front and back halves. To the right, the brain is cut into right and left halves along the mid-sagittal plane, and on the bottom, the brain is cut into top and bottom halves along the transverse plane. The sections that correspond to the plane are just known as the frontal section, mid-sagittal section, and transverse sections. In anatomy, sometimes the position of the forearm is important. We can describe the forearm being in two different positions. First, supinated is when the palms are facing forward or upward. This is the same position we find our forearm in an anatomical position as described previously. When the forearm is supinated, the radius and ulna bones are parallel to each other, as you can see in this animation. The pronated position is when the palms are pointing rearward or downward. It's usually the more comfortable way to hold your arm. The abdominal cavity is fairly large and complicated, so anatomists divide the abdomen into different regional systems. One system divides the abdomen into 4 quadrants, and the system shown here, this is the one I'd like you to know for this class, divides the abdomen into 9 regions. At the center is the umbilical region. You can kind of think that's where the belly button is located, where the umbilical cord would connect. Above and below the umbilical region is the epigastric, and below the hypogastric regions. Epi means above, so that region's above the umbilical, and hypo means below, so that's below the umbilical region. To the right and left of the umbilical region are the right and left lumbar regions. Below the right and left lumbar regions are the left and right inguinal regions, and above the lumbar regions are the right and left hypochondriac regions. Hypo means below and chondria means cartilage. This is in reference to the ribs, which sit above the hypochondriac regions. The human body is divided into different body cavities. These are spaces that enclose our internal organs. The different body cavities have different membranes that line them, and have different modes of embryonic development. There are 4 major body cavities, some of which are subdivided into smaller cavities. First, the cranial cavity, as its name sounds, it's the cavity that surrounds the brain. We also have the vertebral canal, which is the cavity that surrounds our spinal cord. It's found in our vertebrae. The thoracic cavity, which is our chest cavity. The thoracic cavity is subdivided into the pleural cavities. These are the spaces that surround the left and right lungs. The pericardial cavity, cardio means heart, peri means perimeter or to surround, so this is the cavity that surrounds the heart. And the mediastinum, this is the region where the heart is located between the 2 lungs. Finally, our 4th major cavity is the abdominopelvic cavity, which is inferior to the diaphragm. That's the muscle that sits at the base of our lungs, helps us to breathe. The abdominopelvic cavity is divided into the abdominal cavities. That's the upper, larger portion where our stomach and liver are found. And then the pelvic cavity below, which is where our urinary bladder and reproductive organs are located. This diagram here illustrates the different body cavities. Again, the cranial cavity, where our brain is found, vertebral cavity, or vertebral canal, where spinal cord is found, the thoracic cavity in our chest, and our abdominal pelvic cavity below. On this slide, you can see the subdivisions of the thoracic cavity. To the right and left, we have the right pleural and left pleural cavities that surround the lungs. In the center, we have the pericardial cavity surrounding the heart, and then the mediastinum, which is in between the lungs. Mediastinum isn't really a true cavity, it's more just a region where the heart is located between the 2 lungs. And then you can see in this diagram the diaphragm at the bottom, which divides the thoracic cavity from the abdominopelvic cavity below. And that concludes our Chapter 1 lecture slides. Notice all of our slides will end with a handouts slide, which will let you know what documents to look for on Blackboard that'll help you study for this chapter. Good luck.